Now China's leader Xi Jinping has ended his Southeast Asia tour after visiting Cambodia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. She was looking to shore up support as China enters a trade war with the United States. Beijing has implemented crushing trade tariffs in response to US charges on its exports. Now, with Xi refusing to back down, trade tensions look set to escalate. In April, she would describe US President Donald Trump as lacking in confidence, and as he unveiled his global trade tariffs, he was adamant they would usher in a new age of American prosperity. They will give us growth. These tariffs are going to give us growth like you haven't seen before, and it'll be something very special to watch. But after China retaliated with levies of its own, Washington went even further. The US has repeatedly hiked trade tariffs on China since the beginning of February to the current level of 145%. China's hit back each time and now has 125% levies on US goods. Beijing has called the tariff hikes a mistake on a mistake. It says it's ready for negotiations with the US but stresses it would never back down from a bully. If the US harbors ulterior motives and insists on waging a tariff war, trade war, or any other kind of war, China will play along to the end. But China's leaders may think it won't come to that. They possibly believe that political and economic unrest in the US will topple Trump before that happens. Severely higher prices for American consumers or potentially a spike in unemployment could cause the White House to lose public support. China is also trying to bring the US to the negotiating table via other means. It suspended deliveries of a range of critical minerals, a move that could choke the supply of components critical to US manufacturing. Beijing's ruling Communist Party has also shown it's not averse to propping up China's stock market with state investment, and there are other means with which China can fight international diplomacy. China's leader Xi Jinping is looking for business partners around the world, hoping to capitalize on the damage the tariffs have done to America's global reputation. His message: China stands for stability, international trade, the rule of law, and is very much open for business. Let's now speak to Alex Carpri. Alex Carpri says China is playing the long game. He is a senior lecturer at the business school at the UN National University of Singapore. Welcome to Simplify Science. You get the sense that China is banking on the US eventually backing down. How do you see this playing out? Well, I think China has been calculating the long game, and they've looked at a number of things. The first is what was mentioned in your lead-in, and that is that they are now positioning themselves as a reliable, stable, predictable trading partner, contrary to the chaos that we've seen coming out of Washington with the Trump 2.0 tariffs. I think they've taken that message to the whole global south and the whole world, and that's the message we'll be hearing repeatedly as they again look to diversify, look to get other countries to trade with China, to recognize China's investments. They've been touting the Belt and Road Initiative and using that as a sweetener to say, look, we'll build infrastructure, both hard and soft infrastructure, along with our investments and our trade. We'll open up trading avenues for you. So I think there are a lot of things that they're really sort of leaning on and banking on. Alex, you suggested that China may be being overconfident, but just give us a sense of what price China is paying for its retaliation. Well, look, when we look at the so-called trade war, and it certainly is morphing into a full-blown trade war, we have to view this in the broader context of the geopolitical rivalry, right? So that means that in addition to tariffs, there are non-tariff measures, such as export controls and sanctions, that have hurt China, frankly, particularly around semiconductors and AI chips and that sort of thing. So China, if it's playing the long game, which it is, has rolled out restrictions, export controls on critical minerals as we just saw. But it also has to be very careful not to put middle-tier countries like Malaysia, like Vietnam, and others in a position where they feel like they have to choose between China and the United States. Right? That's not what any ASEAN country wants. They want diversification. They want more markets. They want to mitigate the risk of US tariffs by having more deals, more trading relationships. And I think many of those countries are still in a very vulnerable position when it comes to negotiating with the United States. Staying on that thread, as you say, the world's two biggest economies are essentially locked in a trade war. What does this mean for the rest of the world? Well, I think we have to be really, really careful when we look at global supply chains, right? And we have to absolutely distinguish between the very strategic supply chains around the power multiplier technologies, as I call them, AI, semiconductors, data centers, biotech, quantum, etc. Those supply chains, regardless of the new deals that are being struck, are going to continue to bifurcate because they have national security relevance. They have obviously very important defense implications and economic security, even social stability issues. So all countries are going to be looking for a certain degree of self-sufficiency, if you will, or certainly coalitions of the willing to coalesce around these very strategic supply chains. So in that regard, whether it's China or the United States, middle-tier countries are looking for more agency. They're looking to mitigate the risk and avoid that kind of zero-sum, binary choice situation for their trading partners. And just very quickly, Alex, just on the geopolitical implications of all of this, China is using this moment to rally the global south. Is this working? Well, I think that there are many appealing issues to the global south that have been there even before the trade war started. One is de-dollarization, right? Because the US has been able to so effectively weaponize the US dollar. And of course, again, none of those global south countries, as I've mentioned, want to be in a position where it's a binary choice, right? So I think China is opening up more trading opportunities for them. But at the same time, whether it's the global south, whether it's the European Union, or any country in between, I think China just does not have all the playing cards. Nobody has all the playing cards now. I do think China has a sense of optimism, even if it's not overly confident. If we look at what's happened in the United States even in the 2.5, 3 weeks since Trump's so-called Liberation Day, we've already seen that Donald Trump has had to capitulate twice, first, on the imposition of these global tariffs, bringing them down to 10%, although not for China, and also on electronic goods, on things like mobile phones and laptops. So I think that gives the Chinese some reassurance that if they stand their ground, they can indeed push through and see this trade war through to the end. And also, given this idea, we know that China isn't a democratic system, and what that means is that while Americans will be going to the polls in the midterms in 18 months' time, where the American electorate can give an answer to the administration about how they think Donald Trump is doing in the White House, we know that Xi Jinping and other Chinese Communist Party officials aren't faced with an election. And that gives them a sense of security that they can weather whatever political turbulence and dislike comes their way. So in a sense, the Chinese system has more elasticity to absorb the dislike from the population, which simply doesn't exist in America. Yet, there will be some damage done from these tariffs, right? What is China doing to try to protect its economy as best it can? I think the first thing to note is that China has been thinking about the possibility of tariffs since Trump's last presidency 8 years ago. While it doesn't want to be in the situation, it has been somewhat preparing for it. Also, we know, as we spoke about just a second ago, China isn't a democratic system, and what that does is it gives Beijing several levers which it can pull. It could devalue its currency, making exports cheaper and then more attractive to other countries around the world. It could also do more public spending, which would give people in China more yuan in their pocket. And I think the most important thing we saw in the report about Xi Jinping's trip to Asia, what that does is project China as a stable option for investment, for the economy, when on the other side of the Atlantic we have somebody who's mercurial and quite erratic. And that makes China look like a good place for people to do business. Craig, thank you so much for breaking that down for us.